I'll just please accept it.
Okay.
And if everybody could please mute themselves, that would be wonderful. We would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have Professor Michael Gomez here with us this morning. He's going to speak with you for a while and then open it up to question and answer. So you'll all have an opportunity, if you would like, either verbally or through the chat, to ask any questions of Professor Gomez that come up for you over the course of this session. We are also recording this session, as you all know. Later on today or tomorrow, we will send out the recording of the session, and that way you'll all have access to that moving forward. So anything, if you feel like you missed something, or if you feel like you didn't catch something, you will be able to go back and listen to it again. I am Stacy Brenslover-Berman. I'm a professor in the Social Studies Education Department at NYU Steinhardt. And all of my work is with emerging social studies teachers. So this is a topic about which I feel passionately, is something that I'm concerned about as I prepare people to go teach social studies really all over the country. And I know the terrible obstacles that they're dealing with always, but especially right now. I have just a few announcements for you this morning, and then I will send this over to Robbie and then to Professor Gomez, which is why you're here. The first thing that I will tell you is that I am in the process of adding you all to a Google site that we created that has resources for all of you for your own edification as teachers, and some curricular resources that you can use with your students, some information on teaching controversial issues. So during the course of the session today, I will share the link to that in the chat, and it will also be in the follow-up email that I send you later with the recording of today's session. Some of you actually may have gotten pinged to a folder that you can't open yet. It's not open yet. That's why Google is making me add everybody one by one. The other thing that we wanted to share with you, a couple of announcements of future events. On Saturday, December 4th, so a little bit in the future, we'll be having another of these Zoom sessions specifically devoted to teaching controversial issues. Right now, the featured speaker is Professor Jonathan Zimmerman from UPenn, who wrote a book called The Case for Contention, which looks at the history and the current issues facing teachers who wish to teach controversial issues. He'll also be joined by additional panelists that we will announce later. So that's Saturday, December 4th, and information on that will be forthcoming. Additionally, later on during his talk, Professor Gomez will mention an event on October 27th. I'm putting the link in the chat right now, where you can learn more about that event and access it. And then lastly, a couple more events for you. Our very own Professor Robbie Cohen recently published, and Professor Sonia Morrow, who's also here. Sorry, Sonia, I didn't see you. Recently published a book about Howard Zinn's letters, and they're running a couple of events for that coming very, very soon. The first is an event via Zoom on Thursday, November 11th. Where NYU theater students will read high school students' letters to Howard Zinn, which attests to the controversial issues and debates around teaching controversial issues and around different perspectives on history that have existed for a very long time. So all of that information will be sent out to you soon. We wanted to put it on your radar as we begin the session today. And now I will send this over to Robbie, who will introduce Professor Gomez to us.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you all
Stacy.
very much.
Welcome, everybody. Robbie Cohen of NYU's Department of Teaching and Learning. I'd like to welcome you to this important talk at this important moment. I would just say, and it's not going to be any surprise to any of you, in my lifetime, I cannot think of a crazier time, a more illiberal and undemocratic era than the one we have been living through since 2016, with resurgent white nationalism, frightening assault on truth and expertise. Just think about the insurrection of January 6th, the ugly storming of the Capitol by white supremacists carrying Confederate flags, sporting Nazi T-shirts, looking to kill our elected representatives. And this is followed by lots of denial about what actually happened. And the refusal to respect expertise, science, knowledge, whether it's about countering disease or counting ballots. And now, in the wake of the Trump 2020 White House Conference on American History, which slandered history teachers and historians, we have a national movement to outlaw critical discussion of race and slavery in classrooms that's gone on in 28 states. So we're in a difficult moment. But teachers know that controversial ideas and difficult historical topics need to be discussed and debated, not banned. And can people mute, please, so we can hear? Teachers know that difficult topics need to be debated and discussed and not banned. Our job is to push back, to stand up for academic freedom, to remind America that censorship and banning of ideas from classrooms are hallmarks of authoritarian regimes, not democratic societies. As Bill Patterson, a retired high school teacher with whom I worked, wrote me last night, maintaining curiosity, looking at varying viewpoints, appreciating complexity is not normal for humans to pull off. Thus, ever more reason to encourage these later traits in our educational system. Democracy may not be normal, but it is a hell of an idea to strive for and attempt to live by. And towards this end of promoting truth, appreciating complexity, and educating for democracy, we're fortunate to have with us today Professor Michael Gomez of New York University, speaking on the 1619 Project, critical race theory, and the challenge of teaching the African-American experience. A brilliant and accomplished historian, Professor Gomez is more than simply an author and a historical a teacher. He is someone who has done much to provide leadership, to help educate the public to what he's found in his scholarship. He's somebody who's reached out to schools and to teachers. He's worked with UNESCO. He's played a role in trying to disseminate knowledge to help people understand the complexity of the past. And his presence here this morning is another testament to that. So let me tell you a bit about his scholarship. Michael Gomez is a Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern Studies and Islamic Studies at New York University, and the director of NYU's newly established Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. He served as the founding director of the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora from its inception in 2000 to 2007. He is the series editor of the Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora for Cambridge University Press. He's chaired the history department here at NYU and the Spelman College. He served as president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project from 2009 to 2011. His first book, Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, the Pre-Colonial State of Bundu, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 1992, examines a Muslim polity in what is now Eastern Senegal. His next publication, Exchanging Our Country Marks, the Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South, is concerned with questions of culture and race. And it's, in my view, one of the most important books ever published on the history of African identity and the history of American slavery. It's quite a brilliant book, which I've used in my teaching, and I highly recommend it to you. His edited volume, Diasporic Africa, a reader, which came out with NYU Press in 2006, is more fully involved in the idea of African diaspora, as is Reversing Sail, a history of the African diaspora, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2005 and is republished in 2019. His Black Crescent African Muslims in the Americas, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2005, examines how African Muslims negotiated their bondage and freedom throughout the Americas, integrating Islamic Africa into the analysis. Professor Gomez's most recent book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, was brought out by Princeton University Press in 2018. It's a comprehensive study of polity and religion during the region's iconic moment, and it's won prizes. It was awarded the 2019 African Studies Association Book Prize and the 2019 American Historical Association's Martin Klein Prize in African History. So he's quite a record of distinguished and important books on the topics that are concerned to us, which many politicians have been pontificating about but know nothing about. Professor Gomez supports the struggles of African people worldwide, and it's both an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Gomez to you. Professor Gomez.
Thank you, Robbie. I want to thank Professor Cohen and Professor Ben Silver Berman for their gracious invitation and for your preceding remarks. And I want to commend you for your series, in working with elementary high school teachers to move forward these sorts of conversations. So congratulations to you about that. Mercifully, I'm no longer the chair of the history department at NYU. So, but thank you for that very gracious introduction. I want to thank everyone who is present, for joining us this morning, and especially those on the West Coast, or if you're in some other time zone that presents a bit of a challenge. So this morning, I want to talk about the 1619 Project, critical race theory, and the challenge of teaching the African American experience. And so I want to try to, pull all of these threads together as I see them, being very much connected. And I want to build on the comments that Professor Cohen has already enunciated. The frontal assault on critical race theory and the critique of the 1619 Project unfold within a specific political and cultural context from which such attacks cannot be dissociated nor extracted, and indeed actually helps to explain why they are taking place. The recent rise of the celebrity Donald Trump to the highest office of the land, he is near total takeover and indeed makeover of a major political party, redefining it in a naked, unapologetic pursuit of power, is largely explained by his ability to understand and channel a deep reservoir of fear and grievance, a fear of losing, and imagined primacy and degree of control that are actually only enjoyed, in my view, by a narrow elite formation, the latter having been highly successful in getting components of a culturally complex working class to embrace a collectivity of differentiation. Social agitation and migratory activity experienced within a context of economic change and instability are seen through the prism of demographic shifts and are therefore viewed as harbingers of loss, constituting an existential threat. The ventriloquism of the leader of this more recent instantiation taps into and draws from this well of insecurity, increasingly articulated in the idiom of quote unquote replacement. As such, critical race theory, henceforth we'll just use the acronym CRT, and the 1619 Project are seized upon as the ideational representation of the emerging threat, around which a rabid assembly is galvanized, espousing a brand of religiously infused nationalism that is not only racist, sexist, and homophobic at its core, but it is openly so, as publicly avowing positions that comport with the best of ideas that can only be understood as fascist and autocratic. This movement is also consistent with fascism's best practices in misrepresenting CRT in the 1619 Project, actively promoting conspiracy theories that include subscription to the notion that East and West Coast elites are devil-worshiping operators of a child sex ring who also drink their blood, while also defending the January 6, 2021 siege of the nation's capital, sedition by any other name. In fact, obfuscation is critical to this project and is more of a piece with an overarching politics of intentional prevarication. So the country now literally lives and breathes in an atmosphere of constant, unabashed mendacity. As such, the future of the Republic is very much in doubt. In an effort to dispel some of the disinformation concerning CRT and the 1619 Project, and with the understanding that I am an historian and not a legal scholar, I turn to the progenitors of CRT, to those who actually founded and continue to work in these fields, to achieve a more accurate understanding of their projects. With respect to CRT, we begin with the realization that it has been around for some 40 years, and therefore it is nothing new. Kimberley Williams Crenshaw and Richard Delgado were early leaders. And while Crenshaw was the first to coin the phrase critical race theory, the late Derrick Bell is seen as CRT's, quote, intellectual father figure, and has been called the, quote, godfather of CRT. Although they remember it a bit differently, both Crenshaw and Delgado cite a 1989 meeting at the University of Wisconsin as pivotal to the articulation and formation of CRT as a legal theory. In a 2019 article entitled Unmasking Colorblindness in the Law, Lessons from the Formation of Critical Race Theory, Crenshaw observes that critical race theory emerged as an intellectual response to colorblindness in the context of institutional struggles over the scope of equality and the content of legal education. CRT exemplifies how, in the aftermath of a groundbreaking challenge to the social order, institutional actors from across the political spectrum embraced a gradualist strategy of integration premised on the assumption that colorblind meritocracy stood outside the economy of racial power. While celebrated as the ultimate objective of the civil rights movement, its original articulation in constitutional law revealed that formal colorblindness and white supremacy are far less antagonistic to one another than the faithful would otherwise believe. And I'm quoting Crenshaw there. In the 2017 third edition of the book, Critical Race Theory, The Cutting Edge, which was first published in 1995, the same year that Crenshaw published her edited volume, also entitled Critical Race Theory, Delgado describes CRT as a movement, quote unquote, and a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law, unquote. Delgado goes on to outline the basic tenets of CRT, which include the view that, quote, racism is ordinary, not aberrational, unquote. That racism characterizes the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Further, and as summed up by Stephen Sawchuk in Education Week, an article he published in May of 2021, Racism is not merely the product of individual bias or rate or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. And as Paul Butler's July 2021 Washington Post op-ed points out, according to some leading critical race theorists, integration, the traditional progressive route to racial justice, does not actually work for minorities. In this view, white supremacy is so embedded in most American institutions that people of color will never be accepted as equals. I'm quoting Butler here, even when they are formally granted. In returning to Delgado, a second tenet of CRT is that white ascendancy over non-whites performs important psychological, and material purposes for the dominant group. While a third pillar of CRT maintains that race is a social construction with no basis in biological verity, that there's nothing fixed or inherent in the idea of race. A fourth perspective, per Georgetown law professor Janelle George, is that racial progress is accommodated only to the extent that it converges with the interests of white people. The view that race is a social construction is now commonplace, not only in the US, but around the world, and is testimony to the ways in which CRT has influenced our thinking. Indeed, Crenshaw makes the point that with its origins in legal discourse, the ideas of CRT have found resonance in other fields that include psychology, cultural studies, political science, and philosophy. Even so, she acknowledges that CRT is far from the first theoretical formulation to study the phenomenon of what she calls racial power. And she cites Du Bois's 1935 Black Reconstruction as a much earlier candidate for that honor. Delgado makes the point that since CRT's initial iteration, the field has expanded and quote, now includes a well-developed Asian American jurisprudence, a forceful Latino critical contingent, a feisty LGBTQ interest group, and now a Muslim and Arab caucus. Although the groups continue to maintain good relations under the umbrella of critical race theory, each has developed its own body of literature and set of priorities, close quote. Sawchuk's 2021 article points out that as it pertains to education, scholars who study critical race theory look at how policies and practices in K-12 education contribute to persistent racial inequalities in education and advocate for ways to change them. The topics they've studied include racially segregated schools, the underfunding of majority Black and Latino school districts, the disproportionate disciplining of Black students, barriers to gifted programs and selective admission, high schools, and curricula that reinforce racist ideas. Butler goes on to write, and I quote him, "Critical race theory is not a synonym for culturally relevant teaching, which emerged in the 1990s. This teaching approach, that is to say, culturally relevant teaching, seeks to affirm students' ethnic and racial backgrounds and is intellectually rigorous. But it's related in that one of its aims is to help students identify and critique the causes of social inequality in their own lives," close quote. With the foregoing in place, reflection on the discourse brings us back to Derrick Bell's seminal Faces at the Bottom of the Well, published in 1992, and composed of 9 fictive tales that allow Bell the space and permission to explore the truly troubling and perplexing questions at the core of America's racial quagmire. Those questions include, are Black people at home in America, or should they think of themselves as sojourners in a land that will never belong to them? Is racism a social problem that can be solved, or is it a permanent condition like mortality? which can only be met with defiance. Further, can traditional legal standards of objectivity and neutrality lead to justice for Black Americans? Or does fighting racism require a more politically engaged, results-oriented approach to the law? These are indeed the central questions for those concerned with understanding the imbrications of race and power, in some circles referred to as racial capital. But these are not the preoccupations of those who have recently seized upon CRT to inflame the passions of the far right. It appears that they needed some nodal point, some idea around which to rally the troops, and they have chosen CRT. According to the reporting of the Washington Post's Michael Cranish, the key instigators have been Tucker Carlson and Christopher Rufo, the latter claiming to have studied CRT in law school, but in any event realized that because most Americans were unfamiliar with the concept, it could be misrepresented and used to attack an entire range of progressive ideas. Now, Carlson has repeatedly stated that, quote, Black people and their white supporters are on a mission to spread race hate, unquote, in his frequent bashing of CRT on his wildly popular Fox television show. On the 1st of September of 2020, Rufo appeared on Carlson's show, claiming to have uncovered that the federal government has undertaken what he called a cult indoctrination to convince people that the United States is systematically racist. I quote him now. What I've discovered is that critical race theory has become the default ideology of the federal bureaucracy and is now being weaponized against the American people. President Trump was, as usual, watching that evening, at the conclusion of which he tweeted that CRT was, quote, a sickness that cannot be allowed to continue. Only a few days later, following Rufo's appearance on Carlson's show, the White House released a memo stating that federal agencies could no longer spend money on any training that engaged with notions of white privilege, nor any training that suggested that any race is inherently racist. On September 22nd, 21 days after Rufo's appearance on Tucker Carlson's show, Trump signed an executive order banning sensitivity training seminars for federal employees that bore any relationship to so-called critical race theory. Amazingly, Rufo himself, wittingly or unwittingly, revealed just how disingenuous his efforts have been. In his own tweet, released this year on the Ides of March, he wrote, and I quote him, and I'm going to read this slowly. "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans," close quote. Rufo's session in the confessional, therefore, also explains the hysteria over the 1619 Project, led by Nicole Hannah Jones, who is now at Howard University. She launched the project in August of 2019 via a special edition of the New York Times. Not unlike the controversy over CRT, and indeed anticipating it, the importance of the 1619 discussion was magnified by its unfolding within a political context embroiled in mutually constitutive controversies, partially fueled by a presidential primary season in which xenophobic and racist presidential rhetoric and policies were challenged by a number of candidates, also addressing the issue of African-American reparations. Together with the so-called debate over CRT, the discussion over 1619 would appear to represent an inflection point. And if for no one else, at least for the descendants of those transported in 1619, a possible course correction. We now await the publication of Nicole Hannah Jones's subsequent work, The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story, which is due out later this year. Now, as we speak, some 28 states, including New Hampshire, Michigan, Texas, Florida, and South Carolina, and Arkansas, have introduced regulations that restrict teaching about race and racism. Some of these laws take specific aim at what they claim is CRT, while others are crafted more broadly to address what they call, quote unquote, divisive concepts. That CRT and the 1619 Project are now seen in tandem is reflected in laws that seek to, quote, prohibit classroom use of the 1619 Project. Given the fact that these attempts at repressing the exploration of difficult topics are being passed by the same state legislatures that have also passed laws restricting voting and reproductive rights, this is all revelatory, demonstrating that all of these efforts are arguably bereft of any serious intellectual engagement and instead flow from the same font of political calculus. If there was ever a time for evidence-based inquiry, for rational thinking, this is that time. Rather than suspend reasoning and abandoning our calling, as educators, we must redouble our efforts in presenting students with factual information, as well as encouraging them to consider multiple perspectives and become independent thinkers, achieving levels of objectivity from which they are better able to assess any and all truth claims. Now, of course, the real source of discomfort with the 1619 Project is with its very audacity, as its unveiling in 2019 disrupted the celebration of the Mayflower's landing, Mayflower's 1620 landing in Massachusetts. The arrival of some 20 Africans at Point Comfort, Virginia in late August 1619, or what is now Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, introduces a theme at significant variance with the triumphalist narrative associated with the Mayflower. Having been seized by the White Lion, an English privateer flying under the Dutch flag, from the São João Bautista, a Portuguese slave ship en route to Mexico from what is now Angola, these Africans were joined days later by a second group of Africans. The second group was taken from the same Portuguese slaver aboard the English pirate ship, the Treasurer. The lives of these twice stolen Africans, at least some of whom were relocated upriver to Jamestown, became the subject of intense debate during the 400th year memorialization of their advent, as their landing inaugurated the dawn of a distinctive intergenerational experience that nearly half a millennium later continues to inform the lives of their descendants. Scholars disagree over whether they were indentured servants initially, but what is clear is that the status of at least a few inexorably progressed toward slavery. To be sure, they were neither the first Africans enslaved in the Americas, that began in early in the 16th century in Hispaniola, nor were they the first Africans to be enslaved in what would become the United States, as the Spanish introduced captive Africans to South Carolina as early as 1526. Even so, Jamestown constitutes both metaphor and substance of the African-American quote unquote condition, a past that yet shapes the present. The memorialization of 1619 was therefore a critical opportunity to reflect upon what might yet redirect a tragic trajectory. That those who landed in 1619 were not the first Africans to arrive in the Americas underscores the need to understand African-American history and experience from a much more global perspective, in the absence of which we cannot truly understand that history and experience. That is to say, the African-American story is not only part of US history, but it also participates in the histories of other parts of the Americas, Europe, and Africa itself. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong, and in fact, everything right, about the study of the Black experience within the context of the US. But we gain additional and arguably enhanced perspective when we do not confine our consideration to any nation state, but instead investigate the movement of people and ideas and cultures that transcend national boundaries. In so doing, we begin to appreciate the often artificial and arbitrary nature of said boundaries. We can in fact begin to imagine ourselves in ways simply not possible when confined to conventional political borders. So I'm very much a proponent of this approach to the study of Black people. I am a historian of Africa, but I am also a historian of the African diaspora. And so that's my perspective. And as I alluded to in my brief presentation, I have no problem or issue with those who study the African-American experience or the Caribbean experience or the Latino experience, et cetera, et cetera. I have no issue with that. I'm simply making the point that if we open the aperture and begin to see experiences that correlate and at least are similar, and in many instances engage with the particular experience that we have under the microscope, we benefit. And this is certainly the case with African-American history, African-American culture, African-American studies. All of this is imbricated in the histories, experiences, ideas, and influences of other Afrodescendientes, other people of African descent in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa itself. In fact, I think that one of the ways that something to explore, something to think about as it applies to the notion of African diaspora, and Derrick Bell's questions anticipate what I'm saying here. That is, it is an existential conundrum. The concept of diaspora understands that displaced Africans are in spaces that are very, very difficult to interpret. And those spaces lead to questions with respect to where do these populations belong? Do they now have a home? And so diaspora speaks to the liminality of the African descendants' experience. And that liminality is shared all across the Americas and in Europe. Furthermore, a part of that conversation has to do with questions that surround the relationship to Africa itself. And a more careful examination of the history of relationships between Africa and its diaspora reveal a constant back and forth, a constant flow of activity, influences, ideas, both politically, culturally, through the centuries. We are accustomed to thinking about the trajectory of movement as unidirectional, coming from Africa into the Americas in the story. But a more careful examination reveals that there is an unending series of activities that engage both sides of the Atlantic in a constant conversation. Now, sometimes that conversation is a little more muted than at other times, but certainly, you know, with the dawn of that, when in the late 19th century until the present, there is a kind of explosion of these interactions, usually referred to or categorized as Pan-Africanism, but there are other terms for it. And in fact, arguably, more recently, this is all under the rubric of African diasporic studies. It's a continuation of these conversations. So my view is that we can't really, you know, understand African-American history, African-American experience without understanding this, you know, a broader scope of these experiences. For example, just to give you just an example, if we look at the demographics, what we know now is that between 1501 and 1886, about 12.5 million Africans were exported into the Americas by way of the transatlantic slave trade. 12.5 left the continent, 10.7 landed. And if we look at that, nearly 50%, about 45% of all of these Africans wound up in Brazil, 33% in British and French Caribbean, 13% in Spanish claimed lands, only 4% in North America. So we have to, I mean, that's just a statistic that really begins a very, very different conversation and requires that we begin to shift our understanding of the African-American experience as not necessarily at the center of, you know, the broader history and experience of African descendant persons. Important, but not necessarily at the center. And that we have to take into consideration all of these other experiences in order to understand the African-American story. Yeah, I can go on about, I had some ideas here that I wanted to explore with you with respect to other aspects of the slave trade and the experience of enslavement and the post-emancipation experience, the international mobilization of labor, in particular as they pertain to the construction of the Panama Canal, the activity of largely West Indian labor in Honduras, Costa Rica, et cetera, and so forth, under the umbrella of the United Fruit Company, anti-imperial struggles in the Caribbean, which correlate with those in Africa, various kinds of religious and cultural expressions that explode all over the Americas, and a very interesting moment in which we find ourselves, in which we are observing a kind of reknitting of what some refer to as global Africa. So perhaps we can, kind of talk about some of this in the Q&A. I probably have exceeded my time. And so, Professor Cohen, I turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Gomez. Wonderful discussion. And I'd like to open up for questions, but I just wanted to sneak one in first. Is this kind of reaction against the 1619 Project and the critical race theory, is that something that, the United States is unique in, or are these other, because if you think about transnationally, what's going on in the United States seems especially horrendous. But I'm wondering, is that a parochial American perspective, or is this something that's going on in other countries as well? That people who are in your field find yourselves. I mean, what it reminds me of is that, like if you have someone who's studying cancer, you start blaming them for cancer. You study racism, that makes you're divisive, you're promoting, and it's such a such a misleading. I mean, I thought you did a great job of showing how much of this is just all about misinformation and distortion. But I'm wondering, we always talk about American exceptionalism. Is this a kind of a negative form of American exceptionalism, that we are leading the way? I don't mean we, me, and you, but we as the right nation. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. Yes, I'm not muted. That's an excellent question, Professor Cohen. I don't know that I have the answer to it. My sense, however, is that the United States is most definitely at the forefront of this conversation. Now, we are aware of residences in Europe. We are aware of the activities of the far right as political parties in Germany, in France, and so forth. We are also aware of the fact that some of these actors, like Steve Bannon and others, have been involved in transatlantic conversations. They travel, on a regular basis to Europe and consult and collaborate with these far right wing groups. I would suspect that what is happening there is somewhat related, but my understanding, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, Robbie, is that the principal issue there is with African immigrants and Muslim immigrants. And so a lot of the consternation in Europe is being driven by the question of how to respond to immigration. Now, this is related to what we're experiencing in the US. My sense is that and I don't want to go on and on about this because I am not expert on these matters, but my sense is that as individuals are, in some instances, recent migrants, it's able, the right and more conservative groups are able to section them off and to treat them as, non-German, non-French, so forth and so on. The really interesting question becomes, what do you do with people who have been, were born in the country, whose ancestry in places like France go back multiple generations, but who are still not considered to be quote unquote French. And so it raises the question, well, what is a French person? Same thing in the UK. What is an English person? when you have people who are from the Caribbean, West Africa, East Africa, so forth, India, Indian subcontinent, who have been in the UK, whose families have been in the UK for centuries, and yet they're still not considered to be quote unquote English. So there's that insider-outsider dynamic that is at play in places like Europe. What's interesting for us here in the United States, therefore, is the degree to which a similar kind of optic operates in our country. That is to say, here we've just looked at, we've just memorialized the 400th year anniversary of the landing of these people in Virginia. But there's still this kind of insider-outsider perspective. This is what Derrick Bell and others are calling into question, given the difficulties involved in achieving, kind of full citizenship, what in the 19th century Afro-Brazilians referred to as the full free. Given the difficulties in achieving this full citizenship, what is the real nature of this enterprise in the US? And is this something that can ever be achieved? Derrick Bell was very, his conclusion is that we're not going to make it. A very sobering conclusion. I'm not saying that I subscribe to what Bell wrote, but it's sobering.
By the way, the way that you discussed the xenophobia and the racism together really reminded me of the whole birther thing, which was in a way kind of foundational to Trumpism, isn't it? That somehow being African is not American, and that, if you just think about that, the way those things combined, it's really quite striking.
Yeah, and it's and other people will want to get into this, but so we could obviously we could just go on and on all morning about it, but yeah, I think that's one of the, as critical as I am of our former president, he has a kind of genius in that he's able to tap into that kind of deep-seated perspective, and he understands it very, very well. Yeah, and such that, even with the January 6th assault on the Capitol, what really struck me was that the people who were involved in that activity saw it as their right, that they were the Americans. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something that's, very deeply seated, in the American imagination. Yes.
Right. Okay, let's open up for questions. Other questions?
I have a question. Should I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Gomez. What advice would you have for teachers? Well, I should quickly say also that I, as someone like you who is the product of a mixed marriage, so to speak, a West Indian and an African American, I'm accustomed to this liminal space, but what advice do you have, and I kind of like it, but what advice do you have for teachers who are concerned that by widening the aperture, as you put it, that feeds in, and decentering the US diaspora experience, that feeds into a narrative that Black Americans are whiners and complainers?
Yeah. Well, so thank you for that question, Maura. It really gets at, if I may, I think that it really gets at a kind of substratum of this whole conversation. That is that in one way, with respect to the question of 1619, the 1619 Project, CRT, the conversation has to do with the overall relationship between, quote unquote, white America and Black America, or white America and, Black, brown, Asian America. That's certainly true. And we have to engage in that discussion. I'm all in favor of that. But, I think, as we all may accept, more than one thing can be true at the same time. And I think that there's the other component to that conversation is that as we consider the notion of race, and as we consider the notion of the African presence, in the US, it also raises for that community or series of communities the question of who belongs, who does not. How do the different so-called Black ethnicities that constitute, the quote Black community in the US, how do they engage each other? How do they experience each other? And these are very complex questions. They are fraught. They are difficult. I acknowledge that. I think that if at the core of the response to CRT or so-called CRT, and hopefully it's very clear to everyone that what people are talking about is not CRT. That the vast majority of these people have never read 2 sentences written by a scholar of critical race theory, nor have they actually read anything with respect to the 1619 Project. If at the core of that response to CRT in 1619 is the question of who is an American and who isn't, if there's a kind of nativism that is driving that conversation, I find it interesting that, kind of conventionally situated African Americans might then, in relation to other African descendant communities, whether they are from the, whether they're West Indian or Cuban or Puerto Rican and Dominican, so forth and so on. I find it very interesting that in some instances, the response is very similar to those communities. And it betrays the degree to which a kind of Americanism and exceptionalism has seeped into how conventionally situated African Americans view themselves in relation to other people. That's my view. I could be wrong. And so we have, within this constellation of African descendant communities, very interesting kind of stereotypical perspectives toward one another. They're very, very instructive. And so, part of my activism is to kind of fight against that. I find it very, very unproductive. And I think historically indefensible when you look at how, in fact, the ways in which African American culture has developed, so-called African American culture. And I also think that, I just gave you the statistic more with respect to the percentage. 4% of the Africans come to this country. Now that raises all kinds of questions because, by the outbreak of the Civil War, there are like over 4 million people enslaved in this country. So, how did that happen? But it really does force us to rethink. It forces us to rethink what is the appropriate relationship between African Americans and other African descendant people in the Americas and elsewhere? It's an interesting question.
Other questions? Just jump in.
It looks
Hi.
like Nassim has a hand up.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nassim Almontasser. I'm a student at Brooklyn College, and I'm studying history and secondary education. Currently, I'm a student teacher, and thank you, Professor Gomez, for your powerful remarks. I kind of, what's the word? I kind of paraphrased something that you said, and I just had a question about it. As you said something around the lines of, as educators, we must redouble our efforts of teaching multiple perspectives and having students become independent thinkers. I think that's extremely important. However, oftentimes I find that in the New York City public school system, the curriculum is pretty Eurocentric, and I don't see how, the city schools are teaching our youth to become, our scholars to become independent thinkers. As educators, in particular, non-tenured educators, how can we go about those efforts? Because I know that requires risk taking and putting a lot of our, putting our profession on the line.
That's an excellent question. I think that's more in the wheelhouse of Professor Cohen.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would just say, first of all, I mean, maybe something you want to talk about too, Professor Gomez, is that, for example, countering Eurocentrism, one way that Professor Gomez's work speaks to that is not thinking of Africa as just a source of slaves, is understanding Africa and history did not begin. I mean, one problem with the 1619 Project might be that you think, oh, African history begins with us, began when whites interacted in the North America with Africans. And one way to get around that, that's not risky, I think, at all, because you're supposed to, in global history, learn about Africa, is that there was African civilization, very important, before there was slavery. I mean, Professor Gomez, can you say something about that? Because I think that would be a good way of getting around the issue of it being risky, because there is, as part of the global history curriculum, at least, we're supposed to learn about Africa. Because maybe you could say something about that, Professor Gomez.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, Professor Cohen, and it raises for me, if I have a critique of the 1619 Project, so I appreciate what the 1619 Project represents, and I applaud those efforts. I support those efforts. It's regrettable that the conversation begins with the trade and it does not engage with Africa. There is, as a matter of fact, I think there's a kind of almost famous / infamous phrase that is used in the 1619 Project that, African Americans, we were born on the water. We were not born on the water. We have a history. We have an ancestry. We are African descendants. We come from someplace. And if you do not you're missing a critical connection if you don't understand that. And I mean, that's one of the most successful tools of the slavery / imperial / colonial project. It was to sever the African from his ancestry and to convince them that they have no history. Very Hegelian in orientation. So I was very disappointed to read that in the 1619 Project. Once again, I want to say that I support it, but I was very disappointed to see that. And I do hope that in the subsequent publication that will be addressed, because that is a very serious error. So with that said, yeah, I can't get into the specifics and the politics involved in, cultural studies, history, so forth, as it pertains to the New York school system. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I would agree with with Professor Cohen that it's very important to find ways to help students. And it may be that you have to, encourage students to read outside of the textbook if the textbook is or the documents or what have you are suspect or vacuous. We have to find materials that help us, to get across this information. And I'll say this, but it's disappointing. I mean, one of the things that we have to do in the North American context, and indeed in all contexts, is we need to regularize the study of the Black experience. It needs to become normative, and it should not. That is to say that, as long as students have to go someplace else to learn about themselves, we have a serious problem. That in and of itself speaks volumes. And so we've got to find a way to normalize that conversation, but it has to be, it has to be integrated, but it also has to be one that begins to see this experience rooted in Africa and people as human beings, and not as slaves. And that is a rhetoric that is just replete in our curriculum.
And I would just add, I think too, I just want to add that I think that Professor Gomez's book, Exchanging Our Country Marks, could be used really meaningfully even when you get into slavery. Because one of the things that the book shows, I actually have you talking about this rather than me, is that African culture is maintained much longer in North America in the colonial period than people had thought. Professor Gomez even can show you what parts of Africa enslaved peoples came from and how their cultures were maintained. So my point is, even when you're dealing with the New York City Department of Education curriculum, and you're supposed to teach about slavery, you can teach it in a way that is really teaches about African culture and history as well as US history. And I think that, in other words, you can enrich the curriculum in a way that the textbooks do not by having access to this kind of scholarship. And I just add, in this website that we're setting up, we have Professor Gomez talking at length about the book and about regions that different African cultures came from, and also that whole concept of not talking about tribalism, talking about ethnicity. I mean, there's a whole bunch of very rich conceptual work in that book, which is really incisive and I think very teachable in a high school or even a middle school classroom. So I'm just saying, I think it is a legitimate question, a very important question that you're raising, which is, how do you teach this in a curriculum that needs desperately enrichment? And I think one way of doing that is accessing brilliant work like that's transnational, like Professor Gomez's, and integrating it into what you teach. Nobody's going to punish you for that. And that is a way of really transcending the Eurocentrism and the parochialism of the curriculum. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Nasim. Other questions?
I wanted to just build on that and just add a very brief point, responding to Nasim's excellent question. And, Robbie, you're talking about, one way to do this is to integrate Professor Gomez's excellent scholarship. And it just reminds me that, teachers, we often feel that we're working solo, but the work that we're describing it's really intellectual work. I mean, we need to read scholarship, we need to understand the curriculum deeply, and then we need to, do the work of bringing these ideas to kids. And so I think it's important that we support teacher networks and that teachers don't work solo, but that they come together and really work through as teacher intellectuals how to do this work, because it's hard work. So to not be so solo about it.
Okay, that's a great point. Thanks, Sonia. I think it's a really important point. And I think, by the way, one of the reasons that we have these kinds of events is to help that network to develop and to build bridges between the world of scholarship and the world of teaching. And I think for me, the point is that the scholarship is already there. Professor Gomez's book is so useful in, you know, if you look at, you know, there's a study that was done by Teaching Tolerance, I think it was about only 8% of high school juniors knew that that slavery had something to do with the origins of the Civil War. And so one of the reasons why the 1619 Project, despite its problems, is welcome is that it's trying to get us to focus more on this history. And I think of all of the fields of American history, the history of slavery and the history of Africa and the slave trade is tremendously, you know, it's just expanded enormously. You know, it's computerized, digitized. You can find out, you know, how many enslaved peoples were going across the Atlantic at any particular time, and the ships. It's an amazing achievement. We had an exhibit here of Hale Woodruff's murals about the Amistad uprising, and Professor Gomez helped to bring many of these scholars here. It's an amazing field. And so we just shouldn't be restricted to what's in these textbooks or what's in the curriculum, I think, and sort of reaching out to academia and to each other, as Sonia's saying, I think is a really powerful way of accessing this information. But I also want to say, Nasim, that I think the point is that being ambitious to do more is really great. And I want to assure you, you can do it without being punished and without feeling risky. If you're an effective teacher and you get effective, and part of that is about enriching the curriculum, that's a real plus. And so I would just think about it that way. It's not you're putting yourself at risk, but you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions or comments?
Good morning.
Elizabeth Morales. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen and Professor Gomez and everyone else. My question I had posted in the chat, and it had to do with Kimberley Crenshaw's intersectionality. And what I noticed is that when I am with the students, it just seems with these topics, there's so much background to it that we just are not able to, and I'm speaking from experience that just happened this within the last weeks, that we're speaking about identity and how the scholars, they don't really connect with their African descendants. They don't identify as being Africans, even if they are of darker skin, right? And so it becomes really difficult for them to make that connection or even care about the bigger concept. And it just seems like there's so much scaffolding that needs to be done when we're speaking about intersectionality or just the history, not only of enslaved Americans, but also globally, as you pointed out, that, and the differences within. So I'm speaking from ELA. And so because this all has to do with global studies, right? So we talk about it being interdisciplinary, cross-curriculum, but if they're not getting this from other content areas, then it falls on, as an ELA teacher, like to be giving them this whole knowledge of background information and not us being to move forward with what we need to teach, which is a book, right? That has to do with identity.
I agree with your comments, Elizabeth. I don't know that it sounds like there was more of a statement than a question, though, right?
Well, no, my question is, how is it that when the students don't identify, how is it that we're able to have them connect?
I see. Okay. Well, this is it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. You know, we all come out of families and certain kinds of communities, and we are encouraged to see ourselves in a certain kind of way. And and we occupy multiple identities. We occupy multiple communities, you know, racially, ethnically, culturally, with respect to sexual orientation, so forth. We are, you know, in many different places. And so, you know, we live complex lives. All right, so we understand that. I think that the school is a place where we can raise these questions and at least begin to encourage students to consider, how their particular experience may relate to those of others. But it's a project, it is a challenge, it's ongoing, in the university. I'm teaching a course this semester, a large lecture hall. It's filled with students from all over the place, and they do not see themselves as related to each other in any shape, form, or fashion. The fact that they have a concentration of melanin means nothing to them, and that's fine. I understand that. My view is that it's possible to celebrate multiple identities. I don't have an issue with. I don't have any problem with someone who wants to be recognized as belonging to multiple communities, whether it's racially, ethnically, culturally. I think that's perfectly fine. And in fact, it comports with the reality. Some people are not just simply this or that. They are multiple things. And there's no reason why you should not be able to embrace all of who you are. That's the other thing now, because in the US, as opposed to some other places, the way that the US constructs social identity, we tend to be forced to see ourselves as belonging here or belonging there. And so it's a fight, it's a struggle. But in the classroom, we want to at least challenge our students to consider the possibility of seeing themselves in a different way. And I have a lot of hope that is taking place. I think that when students are provided with information and they're provided with and we work with them to hone the skills to interpret and examine and assess that information, it could lead to some really positive, kinds of experiences. And I want to just say something very quickly with respect to, my Dominicana brothers and sisters. There was a time when, you would get into a fight. I mean, it would be a knockdown brawl to call a Dominican Black. And we understand the history of that and the history of Hispaniola, the relationship between Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so we understand that. But in this place in New York City, I have seen a flowering. It is just beautiful. Just seeing people embracing their Africanness. And what it does is it forces us who are not necessarily in that community to say, okay, there are many different ways of being Black. It's not just one way. And yeah, it forces us to, to look again, and to understand that there are many different experiences and many different routes. What I don't like, and what I really challenge my students on, is when you have someone who is visibly of African descent who does not want to acknowledge that, and they want to engage in some kind of fantasy like they were Indio or something like that. That's a problem. That's a psychological problem. That's a health issue. And so that's where I am on that.
I just want to add that I think a more inclusive approach to history, I'm not saying that's going to solve the psychological issue you're talking about, Professor Gomez, but I think one of the issues is that, I did this book years ago called Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, about letters that poor children wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt during the Great Depression. And it really shows these impoverished children. And I taught this book on the Lower East Side at a very high needs, low income school. And the students didn't like, they said they were begging letters like that they were poor children, they were poor and they were like beggars. And that's not like us, we're middle class. Like they couldn't identify, in other words, they just couldn't identify with it and they felt alienated by it and sort of embarrassed by it. So that was them and they're awful. And I think that if you have a more inclusive approach to history, the idea would be that, hey, if you're including African, like, I don't know, just Frederick Douglass or any number of your approach to history is more inclusive, then it's not thinking, oh, this is an out group that didn't make, you're just whining, it's just a history of oppression. No, and in fact, that's one of the positives on 1619 Project, showing that of the great liberation movements in the United States, the Black freedom movement inspired many, many others, that you think about gay liberation being inspired by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or the women's movement growing out of the abolitionist movement and so forth. So I could think that part of, I'm not saying it's a cure-all, right, to what we're talking about gets to be a deep-seated psychological problem, but if we teach American history accurately in an inclusive way, I think we can push back against this tendency to think, oh, white is right, and I don't want to identify with being either low income or African American or whatever it might be. So I think, there's been a lot of backlash against what's called multicultural education over the years. But I think, first of all, an inclusive approach is more accurate, and maybe it could push back on this, what you're describing here. So, and I think the fact that it's not done enough, it contributes to the problem that you're talking about.
Yeah, and Elizabeth raises in the chat she talks about intersectionality. Now, interestingly, Crenshaw was at the forefront of that conversation as well. And another thing that we just need to take into consideration is this whole conversation about ethnicity and race and so forth. Those are important conversations. We need to have those conversations. I have them all the time. But there's another conversation that is parallel with, questions of gender, questions of sexual fluidity, gender fluidity, but also the question of class. Now, one of the critiques of CRT, one of the critiques of critical race theory from Black scholars is that it masks the real issue. And the real issue is class and the relationship of relationship to processes of production and exchange. So that's just something to consider.
I just want to add, just as from that point that you're making, that while the right has been trying to ban this discussion, I think what's really rich is debating it. In other words, that there is a critique, you could say, from the left of both critical race theory and the 1619 Project. So just think about what you could do in a classroom if you first look at why these people want to ban this stuff, right? What the criticisms are coming from the right. And then, some of the ones that, that Professor Gomez talked about, that you might say was from the left, that, we need to be more transnational, that slavery didn't begin in 1619. There are, or how much, want to pay more attention to the indigenous people and what's going on with, their oppression began centuries before 1619. So I just think that what kills me about this, I just should say pedagogically, is they want to make US history more boring by stopping us from talking about controversy and debate. And we need to move in the opposite direction. And I think that part of what Professor Gomez has been providing is a way to engage with these issues that's, going to foster more discussion and more debate. And the one you're talking about, class versus race, is really important. Oh, Elizabeth has her hand up. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Did you want to say something again?
No, I was clapping, and thank you so much.
Okay.
I think that Professor Gomez, the latter point you made was that, which you said so eloquently, and I didn't realize that it is a deep-seated psychological issue. I wasn't seeing it as that when I do have a dark-skinned student saying that he's not from Africa, right? Or he doesn't have descendancy from Africa. And so that to me was, you brought, like, it was like a light bulb to me. Like it's more of an issue of not only identity, but more of themselves, of how they perceive themselves.
Yeah. And if I may quickly, I'm looking in the chat and I see Angeline's comment with respect to Trump, that you wouldn't call him a genius, or his actions a genius. More manipulation. Is nothing genius about Donald Trump. I concur that Trump is certainly no intellectual. There's no doubt about that. And perhaps genius is not the right word, but so perhaps I need to search for a different word. But as we speak, this country is on the precipice of utter disaster. And this man is leading that movement. And as we know, a number of states have changed their voting laws, the most pernicious component of which gives the state legislature in a number of these places, which are dominated by Republicans, the right to object to the state tallies, the tallies in their different districts in their state, and to overturn the will of the people. And in conjunction with the gerrymandering that's going on, we are in a very serious situation. This man is leading that. We are looking at someone who could possibly lead to the overthrow of what we understand to be the republic. This is deadly serious. So if the Democrats don't do something fairly soon with respect to challenging some of these state laws, just the notion that we may be looking at 12 years total of this man in office is unthinkable. But I think we're facing that. We're facing that as a real possibility. So whatever he has, musician, he's a magician, con artist, whatever, it's working for him.
Other questions before we're running out of time? Any other questions that people have? I was wondering, Professor Gomez, if you could say something about what you would hope teachers would do in this, given what's happened with 1619 Project and critical race theory. What would you advise them? What do you think that they should be doing in the face of all this? And how, given all the work you've done on African history and African diaspora history, what would you like to see them most of all in getting students ready to deal with the society and to just be educated about these issues that we've been talking about today?
Well, I think the key is to engender and foster conversations that represent varying perspectives, in some instances, perspectives that are at odds with each other. And the key for me is for students to help their students to acquire the critical thinking skills, the ability to be able to assess an argument, and to understand that what they're being presented with is an argument. From whatever side, it's a position, and people are marshaling information or misinformation. I mean, I think that, now we're on new terrain, Robbie, because now, people are, engaged in their own world of sources. And there's no agreement on what is fact, what is evidence. And so, we've now entered into this kind of factual fantasy world. And it's very, very dangerous. And I think that's, we have to help our students to to be able to think. Yeah, to be able to think, you know what, now what is the argument here? How does this person know this? What is the evidence for this position? What are contrasting perspectives? I think what's really important as well is to get our students to understand contrast. What is motivating the perspective? What is leading to, you know, things like the January 6, 2021 insurrection? What informs that? How are people thinking? And I think that's really, that could be very, very helpful. If I can understand how you're thinking, you know, it helps me to get to where I need to be in terms of my own independent thinking. And I can see whether I want to agree with you or not. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a life or death struggle. It doesn't have to be a life or death struggle.
I think those are important points. I also think there's a new thing, not new, but it's well, in a way it is, I suppose. Like, for instance, when Trump goes on TV and says we can't let Haitian immigrants in because they all have AIDS, right? The idea of this kind of explicit nativism and racism is a different thing that the teachers have to deal with. In other words, like, you know, there's often this, okay, we're going to be objective here, right? But it's objectively racist and xenophobic the way that, you know, politicians, people in this kind of mindset are able to speak now in a way that a generation ago, you know, at least at the federal level, you wouldn't really, national level, you wouldn't have people doing that. So I think that's another kind of challenge. In other words, like, the critical thinking you're talking about is really important. And there's a new context for trying to apply that, right? Because people are saying things that are so outrageous, you know, that we've lost even a sense of civility about these things. So that poses a kind of additional challenge, right? To deal with.
I mean, on the one hand, though, yeah, I agree with you, Robbie. On the other, I agree, and it's you know, it's amazing, you know, that people would be so up front. On the other hand, so on the other hand, we realize that, you know, a number of people have felt this way,
right,
you know, for a long time, but they were able to shroud or conceal or use, you know, other kinds of terminology to convey the same sentiment. But now it's out in the open, and perhaps maybe that's a good thing. You know, the viscerality is, you know, on display for all to see.
Right. So
we all understand, you know, who we are. I like my Klansmen unhooded, you know, so I'm good with that.
Right. I mean, maybe because there was all this pretense of a post-racial America after Obama's election, this kind of is a cold water of reality, right?
Yeah. But it's you know, and then we perhaps will, but you know, maybe we've come to the end. But I would just say that what we're looking at, there's always in the national political life of the country, there are these cycles. The cycles are very consistent. There's a period of relative progress, and then there's always a backlash. There's always a response. And in my lifetime, this is the most serious response that I have seen. And I think that the right was, you know, the right was extremely upset, not only that the presidency was lost, but Georgia was lost, and so forth and so on. And I think that people have decided, okay, we are really going to show you something now. Who controls this country? And we'll see what happens. Right.
Well, that whole language of the election was stolen. Stolen from whom, by whom?
Yeah, right.
Stolen by Fulton County, stolen by Black people stole this election from white America.
And that's an interesting thing. How do you combat, and I don't have an answer for this, but how do you combat the you know, the kind of proliferation of inquiry, all of which lead to the same conclusion? There was no fraud. There was no election fraud. There is no basis for this. And yet there is a persistent belief. Someone mentions it as a cult. There is a belief, a conviction that in fact there was fraud. And so what do you do in a situation where, you know, rationality has been suspended?
No, that is a problem. It also speaks to the whole issue, like for all of your expertise or, you know, all the scholarship on critical race theory, if nobody is, if people on the right don't care to listen and are just using it cynically, the truth is like post-truth almost doesn't matter. But of course, they're not the ones who can be, they're not willing to listen. So the issue is, you know, we have to do better with the next generation and with our students so that they're able to sort of pierce all this, you know, all this misinformation. Anyway, I want to thank Professor Gomez for that a very illuminating talk and the fascinating question and answer. Thank you all for your participation, and please let your colleagues know about our website, because we will be putting this up so that others can access it, because I think what Professor Gomez said is of great importance, and we'll be in touch with you about that. And so thank you all for coming. Okay, thank you, Professor Gomez.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, wonderful Saturday and weekend.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.